New feature release from Airtable this last week when they pushed out their new conditional feature within their automations. Yes, now we can build conditional pathing or conditional grouping right inside of our Airtable automations, making automations even more powerful than before. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down exactly how you can use this new feature, so if that's of interest, stick around and let's get into it. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Gareth and I am the owner at Gap Consulting, where I'm going to help you save up to 20 hours of your time every week using automation. If that's of interest and you want to learn more about how I do that, I invite you to join me in my automation webinar where I teach the fundamental building blocks so that you can start implementing no-code automation yourself. So if that sounds good, check the link below or sign up at garethpronovost.com/webinar-registration and I'll send that training directly to your inbox. But without further ado, let's hop into this video and talk about this new conditional feature within Airtable automations. Now, as always, before we get into the automation, we have to first explain our database structure. I've kept this structure really simple, but I have intentionally included some single select fields so that we can utilize them in our conditional setup that we'll get to in the automation. So first and foremost, we're imagining an email process where we send out an automated email to contacts that live in our database. So in our contacts table, of course, we need an email address, which you find here. We're going to use the first name of the person as well, so it's good to have that. And in this case, I also have a role. And that role can be one of two things, and I've just created some examples here, but in this case, I have a project manager or a consultant role. Now, popping into the email table, this is where we are linking to that contact, selecting a type of email that we want to send. And in this case, I have, again, just two different email types, either a greeting or a check-in. And of course, I'm using some lookup fields here as well that's bringing in more information from the contacts table. I'm looking up the email address. I'm looking up the role of the person. And I also have a now formula here. This formula is going to bring in pretty darn close to real time in terms of what the actual time is at any moment in my database. And this is useful because inside of an automation, I can take this now formula output and place it into my send date, which acts as a confirmation that the email actually got sent. So part of my automation is going to be to capture the date and time that is now in my database and make sure to paste that or plop it into the send date so that we know when the email was actually sent. So let's talk about the types of emails we want to send. We have 4 different options here, 2 different roles and 2 different email types. And the way that we send the email is going to be completely different. Maybe the body of the email is dependent upon the role and the email type. So for example, we might send to group 1, who is a project manager receiving a greeting email. Well, that cohort might receive a very specifically crafted email. Whereas if it were cohort number 2, let's say a project manager who was receiving the check-in email type, well, in this case, then it would be a completely different body within that email. Historically, in order to create this kind of an automation in Airtable, we would need to effectively create 4 different automations. Each automation would have its own unique trigger that said, well, I'm looking for cohort 1, so I'm looking for project manager, greeting. In that case, here's the email that I'm going to send out. And now you're chewing through 4 different automations. It takes a lot more time to set up 4 different tools when in fact, it's really just one process with a different email body every time. That, my friends, is exactly where using conditional automations is going to come into play, because now let's pop into an automation and I'll show you how we can set up these different cohorts or different groups inside of the automation using conditional logic. And from there, we can determine what happens to records that meet that specific cohort. So let's pop into the automation here. Just as we always do, we start with a trigger. Nothing surprising here. I'm simply telling it I'm looking at the email table. I'm looking for making sure that a contact exists for this record. An email type exists. The send date does not exist, meaning we haven't yet sent the email. And of course, I also need to verify that there is an email address on that record. If I have all of that data, then I can start the next part. But you see that I don't actually have any actions here. Instead, I have conditional actions. And this is where we're building different groups inside of our automation. And inside of those groups, we can then perform actions if and when a record for our automation falls within that cohort or grouping. So let's take a look. In my trigger here, let's run a test. Of course, I have only the one record in my database that meets these criteria. And if we open up those field values, we see that the email type is greeting. Moreover, if we want to look at the role, we've got to drill in pretty far here. We go into role, go into the values, go into the record, go into that specific record, and then we see that, yes, this is project manager. Now, I had these extra steps here because if you recall, role is being looked up from the contacts table. But yes, this is a scenario where I have a project manager receiving a greeting, and that is 1 out of 4 possible cohorts for this email. So let's pop in. Inside of our conditional actions, we can test to see if the record that we have in this particular automation currently meets one or more of the different groups that we've set up. In this case, we know it should belong to this project manager and greeting group, where the role is assigned project manager and the email is assigned greeting. So if we come in here and test this group that I already built, you'll see that yes, it does pass the test. We get a success output here that says that yes, the record in question does meet and belong to this cohort. But if we come into another of those cohorts, let's say project manager, where the email is check-in. In this case, if we test the conditions again, we're going to get a failure here because, of course, we know that the record doesn't meet these criteria. So how do we build these particular cohorts? Come down to the bottom and select Add a Group of Conditional Actions. Of course, I've built the 2 cohorts that include Project Manager role, but let's build one where we have the other role. So over here on the right-hand side of my screen, I first simply go back to the record itself, and I need to find the field that I want to test. In this case, it's the role field. So let's scroll on down, find my role, and I need to insert the value here because this is a lookup field. So if the value of the lookup field role is exactly, and this time I don't want project manager, but I want consultant. And in addition to this, I want to add a second condition, and this is that the email type, so I scroll down here to email type, insert that here, is, and then greeting. From here, I can name or describe this particular cohort. It's pretty straightforward here because I've just used 2 single select fields, but if you want to include this, I can say consultant and greeting type. And whatever I type in here is going to show up down here on the bottom and help me keep track of what this group actually is. Now, once I've set up the group, make sure to test that group, test the conditions to make sure that you get the response that you anticipate. As you start building here, I would recommend that you make sure that you can find a success here. So in order to get that, let's go back to our trigger and set up a trigger that has consultant and greeting. Let's go back to our actual data source, and I'll change the role here to consultant. I'll go back to emails to make sure that it is yes, still greeting. Of course, before I can test the cohort or the conditional group, first I need to retest or re-engage my trigger. Need to bring in the new updated data, and now I will have the proper grouping here. And if I test the conditions once again for this particular group, I'll get that green checkbox. Now that we've confirmed that we set up the right filters in our conditional grouping, we can now add some cool actions to this. So for example, we might send an email that has a completely different body, completely different whatever, compared to the emails that would go out for the other cohorts. Now, one thing to note is that from here, we cannot build additional actions that apply to everybody because the automation will take this particular order. A trigger always occurs first, then the actions that apply to everyone or all records that meet this automation trigger, and after that, we will break down the conditional actions. So in this case, I want to timestamp, if you recall, when this email actually got sent. So for this, I will need to build that action here in the action step that occurs every single time, regardless of what cohort I have. So I'll add this action here, and I will, of course, do an update record and add a description to this particular step if you'd like. This will help you stay way more organized and is a really nice feature that I've been waiting for quite some time. Of course, in this case, it's the emails table. I'm going to update the record that triggered the automation, so I'll bring in that record ID. In this case, I want to update the send date with the now formula. Drop that in here and paste that particular current time in. Go ahead and test this action. We can go back to our automation and see that yes, in fact, it's pretty darn close. As I said, now isn't always exact, but it's within 5 or 10 minutes or so, which is pretty darn good. And then, of course, the remainder of the automation would occur. Whatever we built inside of the different conditional actions would then perform, but only when a record meets the conditional filters applied for that grouping. I hope you got a ton of value out of this video and that you start using these conditional automations in building your own automated process. It's going to save a lot of time and, as I mentioned earlier, mean that we don't have to build the same automation over and over and over again with slight variations. Being able to put this all in one automation is going to really streamline the building process. Please subscribe to the channel if you want to stay up on top of all that's happening in the no-code world, especially Airtable, and I will see you in the next video.
As always, I hope you found that to be extremely helpful. If you did and you'd like to learn more, swing by our website and see how we can help. We offer a free Airtable crash course that will help you level up in Airtable quickly, and we also have some paid services, including hourly consultations with our experts. We have some online courses and a group coaching program, and for advanced needs, we can build a bespoke solution for you from scratch. So swing on by, and I look forward to connecting with you soon.